Hello. Give me 1 second. There we go. All right. Today we are going over the applied visual design section of FreeCodeCamp. I'm going to make a drink. And we'll get started. Start some music up. Sure. Right, we're set. All right. Introduction to the Applied Visual Design Challenges. Visual design in web development is a broad topic. It combines typography, color theory, graphics, animation, and page layout to help deliver a site's message. The definition of a good design is a well-discussed subject with many books on the theme. At a basic level, most web content provides a user with information. The visual design of the page can influence its presentation and a user's experience. In web development, HTML gives structure and semantics to a page's content, and CSS controls the layout and appearance of it. This section covers some of the basic tools developers use to create their own visual designs. Applied visual design, create visual balance using the text-align property. This section of the curriculum focuses on applied visual design. The first group of challenges build on the given card layout to show a number of core principles. Text is often a large part of web content. CSS has several options for how to align it with the text-align property. Text-align justify causes all lines of the text to except the last line to meet the left and right edges of the line box. Text-align center centers the text, text-align right aligns the text, and text-align left, the default, left aligns the text. Align the H4 tag's text, which says Google, to the center. Then justify the paragraph tag, which contains information about how Google was founded. So here we'll want to do text-align center. We'll go down here. And we want to text-align justify. Run our test. My keyboard is all wet. We've passed. Applied visual design, adjust the width of an element using the width property. You can specify the width of an element using the width property in CSS. Values can be given in relative length units such as EM, absolute length units such as PX, or as a percentage of its containing parent element. Here's an example that changes the width of an image to 220 pixels. Add a width property to the entire card and set it to an absolute value of 245 pixels. Use the full card class to select the element. So it wants us to do it right here. Width 245 pixels. And then we'll run our code. We've passed. Applied visual design. Adjust the height of an element using the height property. You can specify the height of an element using the height property in CSS, similar to the width property. Here's an example of that changes the height of an image to 20 pixels. Add a height property to the h4 tag and set it to 25 pixels. Run our tests. We passed. Maybe later. Applied visual design. Use the strong tag to make text bold. To make text bold, you can use the strong tag. This is often used to draw attention to text and symbolize that it is important. With the strong tag, the browser applies the CSS of font weight bold to the element. Wrap a strong tag around Stanford University inside the P tag. So around Stanford University, we want a strong tag. Oh, it doesn't want us to do the period. Applied visual design. Use the U tag to underline text. To underline text, you can use the U tag. This is often used to signify that a section of text is important or something to remember. With the U tag, the browser applies the CSS of text decoration underline to the element. Wrap the U tag around the text PhD students. It should not include the parent div that has the class of card text. Note: Try to avoid using the U tag when it could be confused for link. Anchor tags also have a default underline formatting. So we're looking for PhD students. And we want you and you. Run our tests. Passed. Applied visual design. Use the EM tag to italicize text. To emphasize text, you can use the EM tag. This displays text as italicized as the browser applies the CSS of font style italic to the element. Wrap an EM tag around the contents of the paragraph tag to give it emphasis. And we passed. Applied visual design. Use the S tag to strike through text. To strike through text, which is when a horizontal line cuts across the characters, you can use the S tag. It shows that a section of text is no longer valid. With the S tag, the browser applies the CSS of text decoration aligned through to the element. Wrap the S tag around Google inside the H4 tag and then add the word alphabet beside it, which should not have strike through format. Run the tests. Oh, I wanted us to do that. Well, we can just do this, actually. Copy our mistake here, and just highlight Google and paste. Now, delete all this. There we go. Applied visual design. Create a horizontal line using the HR element. You can use the HR tag to add a horizontal line across the width of its containing element. This can be used to define a change in topic or to visually separate groups of content. Add an HR tag underneath the H4 which contains the card title. Note, in HTML, HR is a self-closing tag and therefore doesn't need a separate closing tag. Yep. Okay. Ah. Okay. Instead of adjusting your overall background, okay, like applied visual design, adjust the background color property of text. Instead of adjusting your overall background or the color of the text to make the foreground easily readable, you can add a background color to the element holding the text you want to emphasize. This challenge uses RGBA instead of hex codes or normal RGB. RGBA stands for red, green, blue, and alpha. RGB values can range from 0 to 255. The alpha value can range from 1, which is fully opaque or a solid color, to 0, which is fully transparent or clear. RGBA is great to use in this case, as it allows you to adjust the opacity. This means that you don't have to completely block out the background. You'll use background color RGBA 45 45 45 0.1 for this challenge. It produces a dark gray color that is nearly transparent given the low opacity value of 0.1. To make the text stand out more, adjust the background color of the H4 element to the given RGB value. Also for the 40 or for the H4, remove the height property and the padding, and add padding of 10 pixels. Good to go. Applied visual design. Adjust the size of a header versus a paragraph tag. The font size of header tags H1 through H6 should generally be larger than the font size of paragraph text. This makes it easier for the user to visually understand the layout and level of importance of everything on the page. You use the font size property to adjust the size of the text in an element. To make the heading significantly larger than the paragraph, change the font size of the H4 tag to 27 pixels. Boom. Applied visual design. Add a box shadow to a card-like element. The box shadow property applies one or more shadows to an element. The box shadow property takes values for offset X, how far to push the shadow horizontally from the element, offset Y, how far to push the shadow vertically from the element, blur radius, spread radius, and a color value, in that order. Blur radius and spread radius values are optional. Here's an example of CSS to create multiple shadows with some blur at mostly transparent black colors. The element now has an ID of thumbnail. With this selector, use the example CSS values above to place a box shadow on the card. So we're going to highlight this. So using an ID selector, we're going to add a box shadow with the values it gave us. And that makes it have a fancy shadow around it. It's a card. Applied visual design. Decrease the opacity of an element. The opacity property of an CSS is used to adjust the, or conversely, the transparency for an item. A value of 1 is opaque, which isn't transparent at all. A value of 0.5 is half see-through. A value of 0 is completely transparent. The value given will apply to the entire element, whether that's an image with some transparency or the foreground and background colors for a block of text. Set the opacity of the anchor tags to 0.7 using links class to select them. So right here, good. Applied visual design. Use the text transform property to make text uppercase. The text transform property in CSS is used to change the appearance of text. It's a convenient way to make sure text on a web page appears consistently, without having to change the text content of the actual HTML elements. The following table shows how the different text transform values change the example text transform me. You can do lowercase, you can do uppercase, you can capitalize, you can use initial, which is the default value, or you can inherit to use the text transform value from the parent element. None to default to use the original text. Transform the text of the H4 to be uppercase using the text transform property. Text transform uppercase. Applied visual design. Set the font size for multiple heading elements. The font size property is used to specify how large the text is in a given element. This rule can be used for multiple elements to create visual consistency of text on a page. In this challenge, you'll set the values for all H1 through H6 tags to balance the heading sizes. Fancy. Alright. So we're actually gonna copy this, paste it a whole bunch, and 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. No. I probably should have put this in here. That's fine. We can now just do this. Oh, no. Oh, it lets us do multi-selectors. That's pretty cool. Alright, so then this needs to be 52 and 40 and 32 and 21 and 14, not 15. We've done it. You set the font size of each heading tag in the last challenge. Here you'll adjust the font weight. The font weight property sets how thick or thin characters are in a section of text. Well, we have this fancy... Oh, do we not? Oh, we do, okay. So we can put a cursor here and here and here and all of them. And then we can do font weight. And we'll just do 800. And there we go. So now we just want to select this one and start correcting them. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Applied visual design, set the font size of paragraph text. The font size property in CSS is not limited to headings. It can be applied to any element containing text. Change the value of the font size property for the paragraph to 16 pixels to make it more visible. Tests we've passed. Set the line height of paragraphs. CSS offers the line height property to change the height of each line in a block of text. As the name suggests, it changes the amount of vertical space that each line of text gets. Add a line height property to the P tag and set it to 25 pixels. Excellent. Applied visual design. Adjust the hover state of an anchor tag. This challenge will touch on the usage of pseudo-classes. A pseudo-class is a keyword that can be added to selectors in order to select a specific state of the element. For example, the styling of an anchor can be changed for its hover state using the hover pseudo-class selector. Here's the CSS to change the color of the anchor tag to red during its hover state. Code Editor has a CS rule to style all A tags black. Add a rule so that when the user hovers over an A tag, the color is blue. Change an element's relative position. CSS treats each HTML element as its own box, which is usually referred to as the CSS box model. Block level items automatically start on a new line, think headings, paragraphs, and divs, while inline items sit within the surrounding content, like images or spans. The default layout of elements in this way is called the normal flow of a document, but CSS offers the position property to override it. When the position of an element is set to relative, it allows you to specify how CSS should move it relative to its current position in the normal flow of the page. It pairs with the CSS offset properties of left or right and top or bottom. These say how many pixels, percentages, or EMs to move the item away from where it is normally positioned. The following example moves the paragraph 10 pixels away from the bottom. Changing an element's position to relative does not remove it from the normal flow. Other elements around it still behave as if that item were in its default position. Note: positioning gives you a lot of flexibility and power over the visual layout of the page. It's good to remember that no matter the position of elements, the underlying HTML markup should be organized and make sense when read from top to bottom. This is how users with visual impairments who rely on assistive devices like screen readers access your content. Change the position of the H2 to relative, and use a CSS offset to move it 15 pixels away from the top of where it sits in the normal flow. Notice there is no impact on the positions of the surrounding H1 and P elements. So it wants us to make the position relative and move it away from the top 15 pixels. I'll be right back. All right. Move a relatively positioned element with CSS offsets. The CSS offsets of top or bottom and left or right tell the browser how far to offset an item relative to where it should sit in the normal flow of the document. You're offsetting an element away from a given spot, which moves the element away from the reference side, effectively the opposite direction. As you saw in the last challenge, using the top offset move the H2 downwards. Likewise, using a left offset moves an item to the right. Use CSS offsets to move the H2 15 pixels to the right and 10 pixels up. They're trying to trick you here. So we need to think it's trying to trick you. Yes, it is. So it just explains how it's the opposites, and then it tells you to do the thing in the opposite way. Alright. Applied visual design. Lock an element to its parent with absolute positioning. The next option for this CSS position property is absolute, which locks the element in place relative to its parent container. Unlike the relative position, this removes the element from the normal flow of the document, so surrounding items ignore it. The CSS offset properties, top or bottom and left or right, are used to adjust the position. One nuance with absolute positioning is that it will be locked relative to its closest position ancestor. If you forget to add a position rule to the parent item, this is typically done using position relative, the browser will keep looking up the chain and ultimately default to the body tag. Lock the search bar element to the top right of its section parent by declaring its position as absolute. Give it top and right offsets of 50 pixels each. Position absolute. Top 50 pixels. Right 50 pixels. Lock an element to the browser window with fixed positioning. The next layout scheme that CSS offers is the fixed position, which is a type of absolute positioning that locks an element relative to the browser window. Similar to absolute positioning, it's used with the CSS offset properties and also removes the element from the normal flow of the document. Other items no longer realize where it is positioned, which may require some layout adjustments elsewhere. One key difference from the absolute position is that the element won't move when the user scrolls. The navigation bar in the code is labeled with an ID of navbar. Change this position to fixed and offset it to 0 pixels from the top and 0 pixels from the left. Notice the lack of impact to the H1 position. It hasn't been pushed down to accommodate the navigation bar and would need to be adjusted separately. So we have this, it wants us to give it a position of fixed. And you can see already it just makes it basically pop out of where it was with the normal flow. And we're gonna put it top 0, left 0. We've done it. Applied visual design. Push elements left or right with the float property. The next positioning tool does not actually use position, but sets the float property of an element. Floating elements are removed from the normal flow of a document and pushed to either the left or right of their containing parent element. It's commonly used with the width property to specify how much horizontal space the floated element requires. The given markup would work well as a 2-column layout, with the section and aside elements next to each other. Give the left item a float of left and the right item a float of right. So we're going to float this left. This is how we used to do it old school. Oh, right. Got him. Okay. Change the position of overlapping elements with the z-index property. When elements are positioned to overlap, the element coming later in the HTML markup will, by default, appear on top of the other elements. However, the z-index property can specify the order of how elements are stacked on top of one another. It must be an integer, i.e. a whole number and not a decimal, and higher values for the z-index property of an element move it higher in the stack than those with lower values. Add a z-index property to the element with a class name of first, the red rectangle, and set it to a value of 2 so it covers the other elements. So the second has a z-index of 1 already, so if we do z-index of 2, it goes above it. 3, 4 will work. We could do 0, and then we'll do that. Magic. Okay. Applied visual design. Center an element horizontally using the margin property. Another positioning technique is to center a block element horizontally. One way to do this is to set its margin to a value of auto. This method works for images too. Images are inline elements by default, but can be changed to block elements when you set display property to block. Center the div on the page by adding a margin property with the value of auto. Margin auto. Applied visual design. Learn about complementary colors. Color theory and its impact on design is a deep topic, and only the basics are covered on the following challenge. On a website, color can draw attention to content, evoke emotions, or create visual harmony. Using different combinations of color can really change the look of a website, and a lot of thought can go into picking a color palette that works with your content. The color wheel is a useful tool to visualize how colors relate to each other. It's a circle where similar hues are neighbors and different hues are farther apart. When two colors are opposite each other on the wheel, they are called complementary colors. They have the characteristic that if they are combined, they cancel each other out and create a gray color. However, when placed side by side, these colors appear more vibrant and produce a strong visual contrast. Some examples of complementary colors with their hex codes are red and cyan, green and magenta, blue and yellow. There are many color picking tools available online that have an option to find the complement of a color. Note: for all color challenges, using color can be a powerful way to add visual interest to a page. However, color alone should not be used as the only way to convey important information because users with visual impairments may not understand that content. This issue will be covered in more detail in the Applied Accessibility Challenges. Change the background color property of the blue and yellow classes to their respective colors. Notice how the colors look different next to each other than they do compared against white background. So if we go by what we learned before, these are red, green, and blue. So for blue, we do that. And yellow is red mixed with green. So that's how we get the yellow. Learn about tertiary colors. Computer monitors and device screens create different colors by combining amounts of red, green, and blue light. This is known as the RGB additive color model in modern color theory. Red R, green G, and blue B are called primary colors. Mixing two primary colors creates the secondary colors: cyan by mixing green and blue, magenta by mixing red and blue, and yellow by mixing red and green. You saw these colors in the Complementary Colors Challenge. The secondary colors happen to be the complement to the primary color not used in their creation, and are opposite to that primary color on the color wheel. For example, magenta is made with red and blue and is the complement to green. Tertiary colors are the result of combining a primary color with one of its secondary color neighbors. For example, red primary and yellow secondary make orange. This adds 6 more colors to a simple color wheel for a total of 12. There are various methods of selecting different colors that result in a harmonious combination in design. One example that can use tertiary colors is called the split complementary color scheme. This scheme starts with the base color, then pairs it with the 2 colors that are adjacent to its complement. The 3 colors provide strong visual contrast in a design, but are more subtle when using 2 complementary colors. There are 3 colors created using the split complement. Here are 3 colors created using the split complement scheme: orange, cyan, and raspberry. Change the background color property of the orange, cyan, and raspberry classes to their respective colors. Make sure to use the hex codes, as orange and raspberry are not browser recognized color names. So it wants us to take that and cyan. Adjust the color of various elements to complementary colors. The Complementary Colors Challenge showed that opposite colors on the color wheel can make each other appear more vibrant when placed side by side. However, the strong visual contrast can be jarring if it's overused on a website, and can sometimes make text harder to read if it's placed on complementary colored backgrounds. In practice, one of the colors is usually dominant, and the complement is used to bring visual attention to certain content of the page. This page will use a shade of teal as the dominant color, and its orange complement to visually highlight the sign up button. Change the background color of both header and footer from black to the teal color. Then change the H2 text color to teal as well. Finally, change the background color of the button to orange. Alright. So we've changed the header and the footer. Then change the H2 text color teal as well. Change the background color of the button to orange. Alright. Adjust the hue of a color. Colors have several characteristics including hue, saturation, and lightness. CSS3 introduced the HSL property as an alternative way to pick a color by directly stating these characteristics. Hue is what people generally think of as color if you picture a spectrum of colors starting with red on the left, moving through green in the middle, and blue on the right. The hue is where a color fits along this line. In HSL, hue uses a color wheel concept instead of the spectrum, where the angle of the color on the circle is given as a value between 0 and 360. Saturation is the amount of gray in the color. A fully saturated color has no gray in it, and a minimally saturated color is almost completely gray. This is given as a percentage, with 100% being fully saturated. Lightness is the amount of white or black in a color. The percentage is given ranging from 0% black to 100% white, where 50% is the normal color. Here are a few examples of using HSL with fully saturated normal lightness colors. Change the background color of each div element based on the class names, green, cyan, and blue, using HSL. All three should have full saturation and normal lightness. So we have green first, so we'll just copy this. And then we have cyan. And then we have blue. Great. The HSL option in CSS also makes it easy to adjust the tone of a color. Mixing white with a pure hue creates a tint of that color, and adding black will make a shade. Alternatively, a tone is produced by adding a gray or by both tinting and shading. Recall that the S and L of HSL stand for saturation and lightness, respectively. The saturation percent changes the amount of gray, and the lightness percent determines how much white or black is in the color. This is useful when you have a base hue you like but need different variations of it. Navigation bar on the site currently inherits its background color from the header element. Starting with that color as base, add a background color to the nav element so it uses the same cyan hue but has 80% saturation and 25% lightness values to change its tone and shade. So it's going to have the same, but it's going to be 80% and 25%. Applying a color on HTML elements is not limited to one flat hue. CSS provides the ability to use color transitions, otherwise known as gradients, on elements. This is accessed through the background property's linear gradient function. Here's the general syntax. First argument specifies the direction from which color transition starts. It can be stated as a degree, where 90 degrees makes a vertical gradient and 45 degrees is angled like a backslash. The following arguments specify the order of colors used in the gradient. For example, here we have use a linear gradient for the div element's background color and set it from a direction of 35 degrees to change the color from that one to this other one. So we're just gonna paste this in here. And it wants it to be 35 degrees, and it wants the first color to be CCFFFF, and the second color to be FFCCCC. That's nice. Use a CSS linear gradient to create a striped element. The repeating linear gradient function is very similar to linear gradient, with the major difference that it repeats the specified gradient pattern. Repeating linear gradient accepts a variety of values, but for simplicity, you'll work with an angle value and color stop values in this challenge. The angle value is the direction of the gradient. Color stops are like width values that mark where a transition takes place and are given with a percentage or a number of pixels. In the example demonstrated in the code editor, the gradient starts with the color yellow at 0 pixels, which blends into the second color, blue, at 40 pixels away from the start. Since the next color stop is also at 40 pixels, the gradient immediately changes to the third color, green, which itself blends into the fourth color value, red, as that is 80 pixels away from the beginning of the gradient. For this example, it helps to think about the color stops as pairs, where every two colors blend together. Yellow blend blue, green blend red. Got it. If every two color values stop, if every two color stop values are the same color, the blending isn't noticeable because it's between the same color, followed by a hard transition to the next color, so you end up with stripes. Make stripes by changing the repeating linear gradient to use a gradient angle of 45 degrees, then set the first two color stops to yellow, and finally the second two color stops to black. So 45. Not quite like that. It wants what? Yes. Fancy. Create texture by adding a subtle pattern as a background image. One way to add texture and interest to a background and have it stand out more is to add a subtle pattern. The key is balance, as you don't want the background to stand out too much and take away from the foreground. The background property supports the URL function in order to link to an image of the chosen texture or pattern. The link address is wrapped in quotes inside the parentheses. We got a nice fancy pattern. Applied visual design. Use the CSS transform scale property to change the size of an element. To change the scale of an element, CSS has the transform property along with its scale function. The following code example doubles the size of all the paragraph elements on the page. P transform scale 2. Increase the size of an element with the ID of ball2 to be 1.5 times the original size. Transform scale 1.5. Boom. Got him. Um, hmm. All right, let's use the CSS transform scale property to scale an element on hover. The transform property has a variety of functions that lets you scale, move, rotate, skew, etc. your elements. When used with pseudo classes such as hover that specify a certain state of an element, the transform property can easily add interactivity to your elements. Here's an example to scale the paragraph elements to 2.1 times their original size when a user hovers over them. Add a CSS rule for the hover state of the div and use the transform property to scale the div element to 1.1 times its original size when a user hovers over it. Alright, applied visual design. Use the CSS transform property skew_x to skew an element along the x-axis. The next function of the transform property is skew_x, which skews the selected element along its x or horizontal axis by a given degree. The following code skews the paragraph element by -32 degrees along the x-axis. Transform skew_x -32 degrees. Skew the element with the ID of bottom by 24 degrees along the x-axis by using the transform property. Okay, let's transform this. Skew_x 24 degrees. Boom. Given that the skew_x function skews the selected element along the x-axis by a given degree, it is no surprise that the y skew_x or skew_y property skews an element along the y vertical axis. Skew the element with the ID of top -10 degrees along the y-axis by using the transform property. Transform skew y -10 degrees, please. Got him. By manipulating different selectors and properties, you can make interesting shapes. One of the easier ones to try is a crescent moon shape. For this challenge, you need to work with the box shadow property that sets the shadow of an element, along with the border radius property that controls the roundness of the element's corners. You will create a round, transparent object with a crisp shadow that is slightly offset to the side. The shadow is actually going to be the moon shape you see. In order to create a round object, the border radius property should be set to a value of 50%. You may recall from an earlier challenge that the box shadow property takes values for offset x, offset y, blur radius, spread radius, and a color value in that order. Blur radius and spread radius values are optional. Manipulate the square element in the editor to create the moon shape. First, change the background color to transparent, then set the border radius property to 50% to make the circular shape. Finally, change the box shadow property to set the offset x to 25 pixels, the offset y to 10 pixels, and blur radius to 0, spread radius to 0, and color to blue. Alright. So we have our div here, center. First, change the background color to transparent. Then set the border radius 50%. It'll give us our circle. And then it wants us to change blue moon. Look at that. Applying visual design. Create a more complex shape using CSS and HTML. One of the most popular shapes in the world is the heart shape, and in this challenge, you'll create one using pure CSS. But first, you need to understand the before and after pseudo elements. These pseudo elements are used to add something before or after a selected element. In the following example, a before pseudo element is used to add a rectangle to an element with the class heart. Heart before. Okay. For the before and after pseudo elements to function property, they must have a defined content property. This property is usually used to add things like a photo or text to the selected element. When the before and after pseudo elements are used to make shapes, the content property is still required, but it's set to an empty string. Oh, man. Excuse me. In the above example, the element with the class of heart has a before pseudo element that produces a yellow rectangle with height and width of 50 pixels and 70 pixels respectively. This rectangle has round corners due to its 25% border radius and is positioned absolutely at 5 pixels from left and 50 pixels above the top of the element. Transform the element on the screen to a heart. In the heart after selector, change the background color to pink and the border radius to 50%. Next, target the element with the class heart, just heart, and fill the transform property. Use the rotate function with -45 degrees. Rotate works the same way that skew X and skew Y do. Finally, in the heart before selector, set its content property to an empty string. We got a heart. All the hearts. Well, they're positioned absolute. We can't do that. Alright, applied visual design. Learn how CSS keyframes and animation properties work. To animate an element, you need to know about the animation properties and the keyframes rule. The animation properties control how the animation should behave, and the keyframes rule controls what happens during the animation. There are 8 animation properties in total. No? Okay. This challenge will keep it simple and cover the 2 most important ones first. Animation name sets the name of the animation, which is later used by keyframes to tell CSS which rules go with which animations. Animation duration sets the length of time for the animation. Keyframes is how to specify exactly what happens within the animation over the duration. This is done by giving CSS properties for specific frames during the animation, with percentages ranging from 0 to 100%. If you compare this to a movie, the CS properties for 0% is how the element displays in the opening scenes. The CS properties for 100% is how the elements appear at the end, right before the credits roll. Then CSS applies the magic to transition the element over the given duration to act out the scene. Here's an example to illustrate the usage of keyframes and the animation properties. For the element with anim ID, the code snippet above sets the animation name to colorful and sets the animation duration to 3 seconds. Then the keyframes rule links to the animation properties with the name colorful. It sets the color to blue at the beginning of the animation at 0%, which will transition to yellow by the end of the animation, 100%. You aren't limited to only beginning and transitions. You can set properties for the element for any percentage between 0% and 100%. Create an animation for the element with the ID rect by setting the animation name to rainbow and the animation duration to 4 seconds. Next, declare a keyframes rule and set the background color at the beginning of the animation to 0% to blue, the middle of the animation 50% to green, and the end of the animation 100% to yellow. So we want to say animation name rainbow. Animation duration 4 seconds. At keyframes, this will be called rainbow. And then we're going to have 0%, 50%, and 100%. With background color blue. We'll copy this line so we can easily paste it. And then we're changing it to green. And then yellow. So it just changes colors like magic. Alright. So that should be good. Use CSS animation to change the hover state of a button. You can use CSS keyframes to change the color of a button in its hover state. Here's an example of changing the width of an image on hover. Note that the MS stands for milliseconds, where 1,000 milliseconds is equal to 1 second. Use CSS keyframes to change the background color of the button element so it becomes this color when a user hovers it. The keyframes rule should only have an entry for 100%. Okay, so we already have that. So we're gonna keyframes, background color, and 100%. Background color is going to be 4791D0. I believe that's right. Applied visual design. Modify fill mode of an animation. That's great, but it doesn't work right yet. Notice how the animation resets after 500 milliseconds has passed, causing the button to revert back to the original color. You want the button to stay highlighted. This can be done by setting the animation fill mode property to forwards. The animation fill mode specifies the style applied to an element when the animation has finished. You can set it like so. Set the animation fill mode property of button hover to forward so the button stays highlighted when the user hovers over it. Maybe later. Applied visual design. Create movement using CSS animation. When elements have a specified position, such as fixed or relative, the CSS offset properties right, left, top, and bottom can be used in animation rules to create movement. As shown in the example below, you can push the item downwards then upwards by setting the top property of the 50% keyframe to 50 pixels, but having it set to 0 pixels for the first 0% and the last 100% keyframe. Add a horizontal motion to the div animation. Using the left offset property, add the keyframes rule so rainbow starts at 0 pixels at 0%, moves to 25 pixels at 50%, and ends at negative 25 pixels at 100%. Don't replace the top property in the editor. The animation should have both vertical and horizontal motion. So left at 0, 0 pixels. Left at 50%, it's 25 pixels. And left at 100%, it's negative 25 pixels. Applied visual design. Create visual direction by fading an element from left to right. For this challenge, you'll change the opacity of an animated element so it gradually fades as it reaches the right side of the screen. In the displayed animation, the round element with the gradient background moves to the right by 50%, by the 50% mark of the animation per the keyframes rule. Target the element with ID of ball and add the opacity property set to 0.1 at 50% so the element fades as it moves to the right. Cool. Cool. Animate elements continually using an infinite animation count. The previous challenges covered how to use some of the animation properties in the keyframes rule. Another animation property is the animation iteration count, which allows you to control how many times you would like to loop through the animation. Here's an example. In this case, the animation will stop after running 3 times, but it's possible to make the animation run continuously by setting the value to infinite. To keep the ball bouncing on the right on a continuous loop, change the animation iteration count property to infinite. Make a CSS heartbeat using an infinite animation count. Here's one more continuous animation example with the animation iteration count property that uses the heart you designed in a previous challenge. The 1 second long heartbeat animation consists of 2 animated pieces. The heart elements, including the before and after pieces, are animated to change size using the transform property, and the background div is animated to change its color using the background property. Keep the heart beating by adding the animation iteration count property for both the back class and the heart class, and setting the value to infinite. The heart before and heart after selectors do not need any animation properties. So animation iteration count infinite and animation iteration count infinite. Cool stuff. Alright, applied visual design. Animate elements at variable rates. There are a variety of ways to alter the animation rates of similarly animated elements. So far, this has been achieved by applying an animation iteration count property and setting keyframe rules. To illustrate, the animation on the right consists of two stars that each decrease in size and opacity at the 20% mark in the keyframes rule, which creates the twinkle animation. You can change the keyframes rule for one of the elements so the stars twinkle at different rates. After the animation rate for the element with the class name of star-1 by changing its alter the animation, not after, by changing its keyframes rule to 50%. Cool. In the previous challenge, you changed the animation rates for two similarly animated elements by altering their keyframes rules. You can achieve the same goal by manipulating the animation duration of multiple elements. In the animation running the code editor, there are 3 stars in the sky that twinkle at the same rate on a continuous loop. To make them twinkle at different rates, you can use the animation duration property to you can set the animation duration property to different values for each element. Set the animation duration of the elements with the classes star1, star2, and star3 to 1 second, 0.9 seconds, and 1.1 seconds, respectively. So this, it wants to change. Well, that's already 1 second. So this one's going to change to 0.9. And this one's going to be 1.1. Change animation timing with keywords. In CSS animation, the animation timing function property controls how quickly an animated element changes over the duration of the animation. If the animation is a car moving from point A to point B in a given time, your animation duration, the animation timing function says how the car accelerates and deaccelerates over the course of the drive. There are a number of predefined keywords available for popular options. For example, the default value is ease, which starts slow, speeds up in the middle, and then slows down again in the end. Other options include ease out, which is quick in the beginning, then slows down, ease in, which is slow in the beginning, then speeds up at the end, or linear, which applies a constant animation speed throughout. For the elements with an ID of ball1 and ball2, add the animation timing function property to each and set ball1 to linear and ball2 to ease out. Notice the difference between how the elements move during the animation but end together, since they share the same animation duration of 2 seconds. We're just going to copy this so we don't have to type that all again. Great. Learn how do you pronounce this? Oh, hey.
Bezier curve.
Bezier. We can close this. Learn how Bezier curves work. The last challenge introduced the animation timing function property and a few keywords that change the speed of an animation over its duration. CSS offers an option other than keywords that provides even finer control over how the animation plays out. Throughout the use of Bezier curves. In CSS animation, Bezier curves are used with the cubic Bezier function. The shape of the curve represents how the animation plays out. The curve lives on a 1x1 coordinate system. The x-axis of this coordinate system is the duration of the animation. Think of it as a time scale, and the y-axis is the change in the animation. The cubic Bezier function consists of 4 main points that sit on this 1x1 grid: point 0, point 1, point 2, and point 3. Point 0 and 3 are set for you. They are the beginning and end points, which are always located respectively at the origin 0, 0, and 1, 1. You set the x and y values for the other 2 points, and where you place them in the grid dictates the shape of the curve for the animation to follow. This is done in CSS by declaring the x and y values of the P1 and P2 anchor points in the form. Pulling it all together, here's an example of a Bezier curve in CSS code. The example above, the x and y values are equivalent for each point, which, if you remember from geometry class, results in a line that extends from the origin to the point. The animation is linear change of an element during the length of an animation and is the same as using the linear keyword. In other words, it changes at constant speed. For the element with the ID of ball1, change the value of the animation timing function property linear to its equivalent cubic Bezier function value. Use the point values given in the example above. So we would change this to cubic Bezier, and it'd be 0.25, 0.25, 0.75, 0.75. Sames. Alright. Use a Bezier curve to move a graphic. A previous challenge discussed the ease out keyword that describes an animation change that speeds up first and then slows down at the end of the animation. On the right, the difference between the ease out keyword for the blue element and the linear keyword for the red element is demonstrated. Similar animation progressions to the ease out keyword can be achieved by using a custom cubic Bezier curve function. In general, changing the point 1 and point 2 anchor points drives the creation of different Bezier curves, which controls how the animation progresses through time. Here an example of a Bezier curve using values to mimic the ease out style. Remember that all cubic Bezier functions start with P0 at 0, 0 and end with P3 at 1, 1. In this example, the curve moves faster through the y-axis, starts at 0, goes to P1 y value of 0, then goes to P2 y value of 1. Then it moves through the x-axis, 0 to start, and then 0 for P1, up to 0.5 for P2. As a result, the change in the animated element progresses faster than the time of the animation for that segment. Towards the end of the curve, the relationship between the change in x and y values reverses. The y values move from 1 to 1, no change, and the x values move from 0.58 to 1, making the animation changes progress slower compared to the animation duration. To see the effect of the Bezier curve in action, change the animation timing function of the element with the ID of red to a cubic Bezier function with x1, value set respectively to 0, 0, 0, 0.58, and 1. This will make both elements progress through the animation similarly. Make motion more natural using a Bezier curve. This challenge animates an element to replicate the movement of a ball being juggled. Prior challenges covered the linear and ease out cubic Bezier curves, however, neither depicts the juggling movement accurately. You need to customize a Bezier curve for this. The animation timing function automatically loops at every keyframe when the animation iteration count is set to infinite. Since there is a keyframe rule set in the middle of the animation duration at 50%, it results in two identical animation progressions at the upward and downward movements of the ball. The following cubic Bezier curve simulates a juggling movement. Notice the value of y2 is larger than 1. Although the cubic Bezier curve is mapped on a 1x1 coordinate system and it can only accept x values from 0 to 1, the y value can be set to numbers larger than 1. This results in a bouncing movement that is ideal for simulating a juggling ball. Change the value of the animation timing function of the element with the ID green. Set the values to these respectively, so 0.311 and 0.441 and 0.444, and then this is going to be 1.649. Nice. I think we're done with that section. Yep, we got everything. So I will be back tomorrow at 1 p.m. EST for applied accessibility. This looks like a short one. So we might also be doing these as well. We'll see. We'll see. Anyways. Thank you to anybody that came by, gave me a watch. I will be back later tonight, 8 p.m. EST, for most likely Clash Royale. Hope to see you there.